Hello and welcome to the AI Show, brought to you by Lenovo. I'm your host, Emily Barrett, and I'm thrilled to be your guide into the fascinating world of artificial intelligence. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the AI universe, exploring the latest innovations, the people behind them, and how these technologies are shaping our future. On this episode, we're being joined by Matt Whelan, who I'll be discussing the law around AI in the UK with. So let's begin as we take you on your journey through the world of AI. So Matt, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We usually start just by asking you to do a little bit of an introduction to yourself.
Of course.
And how you've ended up having knowledge of AI and in this space.
Not a problem at all. Yeah, so my name's Matt. I'm a senior associate at Trowers and Hamlins, a law firm. I've been there for about 7 years now. I work in the commercial team, which is a team that deals with sort of contracts between businesses, and one of my key specialisms has been technology, and as with technology it's developed, and that has now become artificial intelligence. So as with most people, I imagine, in this space, it's sort of developed over time, and I probably am a self-professed nerd, so I like reading about AI and I love that sort of technology in general, in my life anyway. So, you know, the two marry together.
Felt natural.
Felt natural. So here I am.
And as I say, in the last 7 years has really been like a big turning point for AI. And we've seen a lot of change and more of it coming in. So we invited you here today, particularly because I wanted to have a little bit of a chat around where things stand legally in terms of implementing AI for companies, because whenever I go into somebody and we talk about what they might want to do with AI, it's one of the big questions that people have is, what legislation do I need to be aware of today? How does that change in potentially if I'm operating in different countries? How does that change? If I'm just operating in the UK, you know, what do I need to be aware of? So very, very broad, open question to start with, but that's basically the question that I think a lot of people are looking at this with is, what do I need to know?
Of course. Yeah, no, and it's a really good question, and it's the question everybody should be asking themselves. And I'd love for it to be a really simple answer, but unfortunately it's not. So the best way to describe it across an international scale is it's a bit of a sliding scale, and down the one end you've got China that regulates everything with an iron fist and very heavily, and then down the other end of the spectrum you've got the US, which is a very much principle-based approach. So companies in the US could sign up to their AI principles, which says that they will sort of work fairly, ethically, and, you know, develop their technology with that in mind. And for the most part, the EU sort of sits in the middle. That has quite a lot of regulation now, but the idea is that their applicability of that regulation is a risk-based approach. So the more risky the AI, the more you have to do to satisfy that approach. Now, in the UK, unfortunately for the time being, there is no specific legislation that relates to AI. So that leaves us in a bit of a grey area. And what's really interesting is that AI is happening now, and we are having to deal with it now. And so whilst government may be needing to think on a broader spectrum, they need to be thinking about international cooperation, they need to be thinking about various other agendas, but people are using artificial intelligence now. So it's currently based on existing laws. So UK GDPR, the Equalities Act in terms of fairness, various other legislations are really, really important, but there is nothing specific that says artificial intelligence is being used and therefore you need to do X, Y, and Z. And if we look slightly towards the future, what's really interesting is that the UK government has sort of changed its stance slightly recently. So currently, or previously, the stance has been that we're pro-innovation and we do not want to fetter people developing technologies, and we do not want to sort of become an impediment to people being really innovative and generating money for the economy. And then since the King's speech, there's been a bit of a shift in that actually some legislation may be more important. And I think since October, the Secretary of State for DSIT, Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, he stated that within a year, we will have some artificial intelligence legislation.
So it's very much watch this space at the moment,
Exactly.
because right now we don't have anything specific,
No.
but within a year there may be something specific if government keeps to the schedule that they have stated.
Exactly.
And that's always a big if.
It's exactly, and it's still unknown, and we don't know what that would look like. It may be sort of a very broad legislation. It could be a really stringent legislation. We don't know. The one thing that has given us a bit of an indication of what it will be like is there was a treaty signed at the end of last year between the US, the EU, amongst other countries, and the UK. And that treaty basically said there should be sort of a guiding principle for international sort of legislation and or just the way forward. They need to be thinking about ethical considerations. They need to be thinking about accountability, explainability, all of these different factors. And that, I suppose, that framework gives us an indication that the UK will be looking to its international partners and thinking, how do we align ourselves? Because the reality is it's no good if we go down one route and that in particular the EU and the US goes down another. It's very, very difficult for us. So I think that will be an interesting thing to watch because that could really dictate where the government goes.
Yeah, and I think part of that key understanding for people to have then is what that international scene looks like. So you've mentioned already that the US is very much, it's a principle-based scheme that people can sign up to. So there is less legislation there than there are in other places. From an EU perspective, what does that look like at the moment?
Yeah, so that's very much more in the middle, and it's prescriptive legislation, but it's based on the type of technology and the risk involved. So if you have a low-level AI, for example, an email spam filter, that is considered low risk and there is almost nothing you need to do in terms of the legislation. If you then ramp it up and you think about something way more advanced that actually deals with individuals' free will or something like that, then that is banned. So there's these two sort of bookends of how the legislation works. And then in between, there is two sort of additional risk factors, which are limited risk and high risk. And you have to assess your technology based on how it works, what it does, who it's affecting, for it to fit into these categories. And then there is a risk profile for you to adhere to. So I personally think it's quite a good way of doing it because it's trying not to stifle innovation with you absolutely need to be really stringent with everything you do, even for spam filters. But it's also making sure that it's not an open-ended question of, you can do whatever you want. And it's still really important to think about the technology. Why do you need it? What you're using it for? Who are you affecting? Because it has wide-ranging effects. And if you are a company, as you said at the beginning, that is not just a small entity but working cross-border, then you need to have all of these things in mind. And it's really complex. It's really complex because everything's moving in different ways and at the same pace, different paces rather. And as a small company, you may be looking at it and going, what do I do? It's hard.
Yeah, and I think, there are a lot of smaller companies or, medium-sized companies, some of them are large companies, looking at this and going, actually, because we don't know what the state of this UK legislation is going to look like, it puts me in a risky position if I look to implement something now, and then that legislation that comes in means I've got to change what it is I've implemented today, right? So I think that whole, we are going to legislate for it, but we don't know what that looks like yet or exactly when it's going to happen, does create a little bit of a barrier to people looking at technology and adopting that technology, which is completely understandable. And I think at the moment a lot of people are looking at, right, okay, well in that case, what can I do in terms of best practice? What do I need to be looking at in terms of adhering to kind of give myself a safer space than going, well, anything goes, I'm just going to do whatever the heck I want.
Yes.
Which has also, I'd say, ethical and moral considerations for you as a company and for your brand, right? So I would always counsel people to say, just, have a think about it. Is it something you should be doing?
Yep.
But equally, from that legal perspective, if people are wanting a safer bet, whose guidance should they be looking at? Should they be going, well, this wouldn't pass mustard in China, therefore I'm not going to do it? Or do we look at the US, which is a lot looser, and go, well, hey, anything goes, we'll just crack on?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's no right answer in a sense, but what we are sort of advising people is that you really should, as you say, take that step back and think, firstly, do I need the technology? What am I using it for? Because it's not as simple as we're just going to use it. And it shouldn't be that simple. It's, quite an advanced technology, and you do need to know how to use it, understand how to use it, and have the accountability to be able to explain how it works and how it should be used to anybody that's, it's used by, or whose data it uses. So it should really be thought about, and it should be a staged process. And then in terms of the legislation, it's a really tricky one, because in the UK at the moment, you would be looking at, UK GDPR principally, and, you'd want to build in some amount of fairness in terms of the Equalities Act. But I think if you really are expecting legislation to come down the line as we are, then the likelihood is we are going to have to align to an international standard. And as with many of our legislations, it is the European Union that we do look to, and historically we have looked to, because a lot of our business is done there. So it is a really useful tool. And what we're saying to people at the moment is, whilst you may not want to adhere to it fully, have a look at it, have a think about it. And actually, the risk-based approach is not illogical, even if you're not trying to adhere to a legislation. Have a think about why you're using it, do a risk assessment. How do we mitigate any issues that arise? Are we building fairness and ethics into our algorithms? What are we doing to make sure that we are, or could easily adhere to the EU legislation if the UK follows that approach? And I think for the most part, that is the best one to follow, because China's a bit too hard to follow, because with prescriptive legislation, you need to know what it is to follow. But the US equally, that's, their current position, and some would say it's perhaps a sort of a point in time where they're just transitioning, and that's where the UK is now. And because we know we're going towards legislation, the EU's the best approach at the moment for us, at least.
Okay. It's, I say, really useful in terms of direction when you're looking at that international scene. And it is, I think whenever we start talking about legislation around technology, you do have to take a step back and look at things internationally. One of the things I just wanted to clarify is, if as a business, I am looking to implement an AI technology, so let's take that email spam filter example, but I'm not building that technology myself. I'm going out and I want to purchase that from somebody else. If I am an EU company, I'm a company that operates in the EU, so I'm aware that if I look at AI, I need to think about the EU AI Act. But who is that onus on to do that risk assessment and make sure that the technology is adhering to whatever the AI Act states? Is that on the software provider, or is that on the company purchasing the software, or is it on both of those people?
Well, I'm going to give a controversial answer now and say, I would say it doesn't really matter what the legislation says, because I think it should be on both. And I think it should be on both in different ways. So I think the supplier needs to be adhering to the legislation regardless, and it needs to be building by design the AI to factor in all of the good elements that we really need to adhere to in terms of the principles of both the UK and the US, but also anything that the EU Act says as well. But I think more broadly, people just need to be conscious that we have the ability with this technology now, is we are at the start of it, and we've gone through, the dot-com bubble and various other bubbles now, where we know that we can build this from the ground up. And I think if I was a customer buying some of the AI technology, notwithstanding that the supplier should be responsible for a lot of this stuff, I would be going in with a really strict agenda of, tell me what you're doing in terms of how the AI works. Explain it to me. Can you explain it? Can you set out, transparency? How is it working? How are we showing people how it works? Can you show that you're accountable for it? From a legal point of view, what I would be looking at is in that contract between the customer and the supplier, I'd be really thinking very strictly about AI provisions within that and thinking about what do we need for a specific AI technology to be reflected in this contract. So for the most part, that's fairly new. That's fairly new in the legal world, but there are things you can do and should be doing. And you also need to be looking at a couple of things in particular. Data protection, it needs to be
hugely
very
important.
stringent, exactly. And security in general, that is, so important in sort of a digitalized world. You need to be looking at intellectual property, and you need to be asking the questions, who owns the data that you've trained the model on? And you need to be very clear in your documentation, who owns any of the outputs. Make sure it's very clear who owns. So if you're asking, or getting an AI for a specific purpose, do you need to own the outputs? Do you need to use them for a particular purpose? That intellectual property is really important. And then also think about liability. So if something goes wrong, God forbid, you have to think of the worst scenarios. So is it going to be the supplier because you don't know how the technology works? Is that going to fly with your ultimate end customers and end users? Well, no, you've gone out and got the technology. You should know how it works. You should know. But in this contract, you can divvy up the responsibility as well. So it's one thing under the legislation, but I think the reality is it needs to be, everybody needs to be alive to the fact that they have some responsibility and they need some accountability.
And I think it's really key for people to just be bearing that in mind when they are starting to look at AI projects, especially if people are starting to move towards that. Actually, I want to roll this out. I want to move to a larger implementation phase. Maybe I've been testing something, and whilst I've been testing it, we haven't necessarily had to worry about all of that because it's been a very small controlled test. But now we're looking at rolling it out into a larger environment. And actually, I do need to think about what do my customers expect from me in terms of responsibility? What is it that, I need to be thinking about, especially from that data perspective? I mean, we spend a lot of time, if you go back through the episodes of this show, a lot of time we spend talking about data, because without data, there is no AI, right? So actually how you protect that data, what data you're gathering as part of this project, or what data you're generating, is really, really important to think about, especially if you are going to be touching on any form of data that is in any way protected
Absolutely.
under current legislation.
So true.
And generally now, I think when we're talking about AI, people are thinking about use cases where you might actually end up dealing with people's sensitive personal information. And in that case, you really need to be thinking about how does GDPR and the legislation around this integrate into this project, and having that foundation of actually how do I do my data management, and at my data management layer, am I as a company 100% sure that we are adhering to all of the relevant legislation around our data storage as well, is a really important question, I think, for people to be asking, because people are still, I don't want to say people are still figuring that out, but there are instances where, we see there are still cases where people are tripping up over this.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's so true. And it goes back to basics in a certain sense. If you give an example that doesn't involve data, but just an object, you want to protect it and you need to protect it. And if it's somebody else's object, then you want to protect it even more. Like, you've got a responsibility to do that. And I think if you, think about the practical aspects of what you want the technology to do and how you use it, and the data management around it, you really need to do quite a bit of thinking before you even get to implementing anything, and you need to do that thought process before you even approach the market. And I think a lot of people are seeing AI as a bit of a buzzword. A lot of technology is being rebranded as AI when it might not necessarily be. And I think we're lucky in a sense that it's a really big topic of conversation. So it's in the normal vernacular now, and people are using it and do understand it a lot more. But I think people do need to educate themselves, because at some point in time, this technology will be coming to their business or their suppliers or their customers. And whilst they don't need to be a tech person, I'm not a tech person, to understand it, you do need to have that level of understanding to take on the responsibility of using that technology. You know, it would be the same with any technology. You know, you wouldn't bring a machine into the workforce if you didn't think it was safe, if you hadn't tested it before, if you hadn't got, you know, a contract with the supplier to make sure that any, you know, defects were remedied, things like that. It's the same thing, but you just need, there's a couple of other additional steps you need to take in terms of artificial intelligence. One of the interesting points that we're seeing in contracts at the moment is AI that's being used long term. You need to have a think about you know, maintaining it really, and who's going to be doing that. And that's something people don't always think about, because there's a concept known as model drift. And if you leave the model, it'll teach itself, but you may want it to go down road A and it just wanders off down road B because it doesn't have any parameters to it, so it can, which is great. It's just doing its thing, which is, you know, amazing in itself. But you just need to build that in as well. So there's a couple of these extra concepts that are new, but actually the basis of what AI technology is doing should be sort of followed with any sort of technology and thought about sensibly, fairly, and, you know, proactively doing something about it.
Yeah, it is, as you say, with any technology, you should be thinking about these kinds of things. But for AI, perhaps even more so at the moment, because it's still a bit new, and there's a lot we take for granted when we're dealing with older technologies that we can't necessarily take for granted when we are looking at AI, because especially in the UK, we don't have that legislation in place. So it isn't necessarily guaranteed that everybody is going to be adhering to a certain set of standards or principles. It is a bit of a, I don't like to use the term Wild West, but it is a bit of a free-for-all out there at the moment. So it is really important for companies that they are doing this due diligence and checking what they're using, who they're talking to, and checking what data they're using as well around it.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember as well, this happens every time there's a new thing that comes into existence. It goes through a process of transition from everybody getting used to it, starting to use it, it becoming mainstream, and then sort of, I suppose, legislation and things following. It's very unlikely that it's the other way around. And if we take data protection as an example, we had a Data Protection Act in 1998. Did many people follow it? Not really. It was only until 2018 when everybody sort of understood it a lot more. There was a lot stricter parameters to the situation and the data being used, that now actually it's become day to day for most people in business. So it's not something to be afraid of or to be unnerved by. It is this natural process we're going through, and people are lobbying for and against having more legislation. People are talking about it. It is, you know, being discussed in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So it is, you know, at the forefront of people's minds, and we can see from the King's speech last year as well that it, you know, again has been commented on, and it will, something will come of it. It's just getting it right when we are at a unique juncture where we are able to say, well, actually, how do we learn from our previous sort of implementations of these legislations? What is best for us? Does GDPR work? How do we tweak that and use that as a basis? How do we create the new aspects of the legislation that we need to create because it's different? You know, it's going to be an interesting one to watch.
Definitely. Yeah. So thank you very much for coming and talking to us today. It has been, I've found it really interesting, and I hope everyone else has. And we hope to see you again on the next episode of the show.